I Love Black People Radio on HUR Voices, Sirius XM, Channel 141. I Love Black People is more than a radio show. I Love Black People is a call from our ancestors to protect us from racial profiling all across the world. Go to iloveblackpeople.com and become a member today. Membership empowers you to live fearlessly and protect Black people globally from racism and xenophobia. Join us today and become a member of our global network with an online global green book with Black-owned and Black-friendly businesses to protect you and your community. Membership is free, and with you, we will become 10 million strong worldwide. I am because we are. Special thanks to AFLAC for supporting I Love Black People Radio.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of I Love Black People, and just so thankful to have this opportunity to share with you and actually go over some of the things that we've actually done in the last year. About a year ago, there was an invasion of Ukraine by the Russian government, and we, as I Love Black People, went out to Poland to help with some of the students who were members of I Love Black People who were fleeing the war and racism. So that's the backdrop of what we're going to be discussing today, to kind of give a year later, the context of the war in Ukraine, as well as the many wars that are actually raging all over the world. There's a lot of focus on this particular area, and I want to say that I might have a particular vantage point or viewpoint because I'm actually a military brat, if you didn't know. My father was in the Air Force during Vietnam, and I was literally born in this place called Great Falls, Montana, next to a military base where they had the Minuteman missiles. And my grandfather was in the Navy during World War II, and one of the Tuskegee Airmen is also a relative of Wendell Pruitt, who my people are, come from St. Louis. So that being the context, if you're from St. Louis, you know about the Pruitt-Igoe. And Igoe was a politician, and Wendell Pruitt is the Pruitt name in the housing projects. And it was actually an infamous housing project that ended up being torn down, I want to say, in the late 70s, if not early 80s. And my family was raised in the Cochran housing projects in St. Louis. So we're looking at the context of the military and the war that we see right now. My vantage point was actually someone growing up on a military base during the Cold War. And even to this day, my father still has a negative view of Russia based on the former Soviet Union. And that's some of the backdrop that we see. It almost, I don't participate in African tribalism, but even some of this, it seems almost like a European tribalism with the vilification of one group versus the other, when in actuality, the issue of using military weapons and war as a form of foreign policy is something that's used by all these governments, including the United States. And I think it's important for us who are concerned with peace. And again, even though that I was born as a military brat and lived on military bases, literally, there's a place in Nebraska called Offutt Air Force Base, and it's called SAC Headquarters, Strategic Air Command. I'm giving you language from the Air Force, but literally, my dad was like in this bunker, like several miles underneath the ground, where they literally were the ones if they decided to push the buttons, these are the folks who are going to decide, to make sure these missiles were launched and the world being destroyed. And I think one of the things that's different now, unlike the 80s, when again, there was a clock talking about how close we were, the doomsday clock, and how many seconds or minutes were we from a nuclear annihilation. Now, when talking to the folks, again, I think there seems to be a disconnect with the impact of war. In those days, we literally had to, sirens going off just in case there was a bomb, a nuclear bomb being dropped on us from the Soviet Union. And they had bomb shelters. You'll even see, even to this day, they'll have these like symbols of the nuclear radioactivity like symbol, where it shows you where these are places where you would go in case of a nuclear holocaust. Now, fast forward, we're in 2023, and we have basically NATO, uh, the 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 Western countries coming together as it relates to Russia invasion in Ukraine. And so now we have a conversation where many of those same, players where we were thinking of the Cold War, we still have a Cold War where on one side you have nuclear capable Russia, and on the other side you have a nuclear capable NATO, including the United States. And again, the North Atlantic, trade organization, treaty organization, people always wonder, that's Western Europe. What does the United States have to do with it? Well, the United States always wanted to make sure they stayed engaged in European politics. So to call it a North Atlantic, it allows it to be an inclusive organization to include the United States. And in a way, that has created an environment where, and climate where confrontation, even though there's no longer a Warsaw Pact. And again, that was the group or treaty that included the so-called satellite communist countries that were part of the Soviet Union sphere of influence. And now, and I will even say in my younger years, when we would talk about, stopping the nuclear proliferation, this was more of a so-called Democrat perspective. The Russians the Soviet Union being the villain was something the Republicans used, even with Ronald Reagan talking about, tear the wall down. And as we see in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. With that being said, how do we find ourselves here where literally a false move, a provocation could lead to nuclear disaster? At what cost? And I think contextually, as we look at this, it's part of what we've seen, and it's not just right now, but the glorification of war and how we as citizens of the world in general, even in the United States, look at the context of war. And those things are often glorified as opposed to actually critically analyzed. Even when we learn history, when we're growing up, we're learning history. If you really just kind of reflect, some of it seems more not necessarily history, but just a reaccount of different wars. In the U.S. Schools, they would talk about the Revolutionary War, which was against the United States versus the British monarchy. Then we would talk about the War 1812, and then we would talk about the Civil War, and then the Spanish American War, and World War One, World War Two, Korea, Vietnam. And literally, these are all military conflicts that, when we're learning history, almost have us revolving the world around these conflicts. Even when we talk about wars in other places, the history of Europe is oftentimes described by a series of invasions and wars. Colonialism, again, this conversation of conquest. Looking at the United States and what happened to the indigenous population here. Again, it's told, we growing up, we played these games with these cap guns, shooting each other, and it was cowboys and Indians, even though India is a total different subcontinent. Literally, those are the things that we've been kind of like brought up in the context of this Western influence, that war and the vanquished and the victors as a way to move the world forward. And I think some of that has desensitized us from the real horror and humiliations of war. And even, being as someone who had, attended Tuskegee and the Tuskegee Airmen, I think oftentimes the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, it doesn't really speak to the fact there was a community of Black folks that literally built a incredible space for the development of folks to learn how to fly, and there's a host of other things that were done. We end up speaking very narrowly about what was done in order to fight in conflict. And just mentioned in my great cousin, if you will, Wendell Pruitt, he actually didn't die in World War II in the battlefield. He actually flew and actually sunk an Italian destroyer. and came back as a type of ship that the Italians had. He didn't get killed until he came back, and while giving a training flight, he actually died in Alabama. And what they didn't talk about was that literally in the theater of war, the black pilots had the best planes, the P-47s or the P-51s. And these planes were used to kind of, support the bombers and fighter squadrons. And they were the best technology. But then when it came back stateside, they had some of the worst and the hand-me-down aircrafts. And literally, he died giving, Wendell Pruitt died giving flight lessons, if you can imagine that, not while being shot at in World War II by the Nazis. So these are things that when we start looking at war and how it's glorified, and we start really peeling back the layers of war, it shows us there's a very different story. And there's a famous general, a general that was one of the most decorated generals in American history. He was a Marine, Smedley Butler. He was a major general. He actually was in the military from like the late 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. And he talked about how war in World War I and the Spanish-American War was used as a way not to really benefit the people, but actually to benefit, a handful of folks that had commercial and monetary interests, not the interests of justice and peace and fairness that we so often hear when we talk about war and the actual, we're told what the reasons are. Even when we're watching the TV messages, you'll never hear them attack the actual military of the United States. They'll never judge that. The last time you've seen critical analysis of the military in the United States was the Vietnam War. And if you follow it, literally up until the Vietnam War, let's say 1975, I think when the last soldier came out of there, up until now, you've not seen the scrutiny around the military. Every year, the military, and they call it defense budget. Now, a lot of people don't know, but it literally used to be called the War Department. So it's Defense Department now, but they used to be actually called the War Department. And literally, the focus was war. And if we really analyze it now, the United States has probably over 700 military bases. I think the closest country with as many bases is maybe 6 or 7. So we literally have already blanketed the world with military. Again, saying that the Department of Defense may not be, appropriate, because right now we've seen much of the projection of military and violence as it relates to the war effort. Much of that is being projected by, the aircraft carriers and the military positions, AFRICOM, and these military alliances like NATO, where literally much of this military activity has come out of. And then we can just look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. These are all conflicts where the military of the so-called Western power played the biggest role in, and consistently. And this Major General Smedley Butler, he outlined it and said, war is a racket. He said, it always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one, international in scope, is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. So when we're looking at conflict in Ukraine, and you often hear the conversation become a conversation of military weapons, tanks, missiles, missile defense systems. And all of these things are being paid for with U.S. tax dollars. So U.S. tax dollars are being used, and just like in Afghanistan, The $1 trillion that was spent, the $1 trillion came from the U.S. taxpayer. Now, there's so many issues that people are having all over the world, particularly in the United States. Literally, more weapons probably are not going to solve those problems. Yet that becomes the focus. And the people who make these weapons, I mean, weapons are very problematic because, once you sell one, just imagine, it's harder to sell another one unless they use that one up. So as long as these people are making profit from war, it's going to be hard for someone with a business model like that to see the end of war being something that they would support. And General Medley, General Butler spoke to that. He said that, when people have to give up their jobs, and this is during the times of being drafted. So oftentimes, we look at it now, we have a volunteer military. During my dad's era and on back, these were, a time where they had draft. Even I'm 53. I still remember we had to sign up when we went to college, like at the post office, just in case there was a draft. We had to like fill out this paperwork where literally they would have our information, and if something happened. And even when I was in college during the first Persian Gulf War, and looking at those issues from that perspective, we have friends who looked at the military as an opportunity, much even like my father, as a way to get out of the projects or get out of financial difficulties. So many people had signed up for ROTC in order to, pay for college. And then when the first Persian Gulf War came and they said they were going to be sending soldiers, up until that point, and I say that was like 1991-ish, there hadn't been a full-fledged conflict. There had been an invasion in Grenada. There had been some conflicts, I know, in Panama, but nothing at the scale of the Persian Gulf. And many of those students who are now, graduating were fearful that now they had to, find themselves in a desert somewhere in Kuwait or Iraq, and might find themselves, all their dreams of a future bright from being funded by the U.S. government's ROTC program go up in smoke. So there's a lot of this that when we discuss it and talk about how war impacts our communities, we never really get a chance to actually step back and look at it contextually and see who's benefiting and who's actually getting harmed. So if we're really looking at it, the young people who are giving up their lives to dedicate to be trained, to be stationed in these places, they're giving of themselves. One of the things that General Butler said was that just as much as the individual is asked to give a sacrifice, the companies, the corporations should be giving a sacrifice also. One of the points he made, even before World War I, he said the same company was selling boots for one price before World War I, but when the war started, the cost of the boots went up tenfold, and they made money selling those boots to the government. He said that should never be possible. There should never be an opportunity to profiteer from something that's as deadly and harmful as war. And so if you see that, and you even hear Dwight Eisenhower, he actually made a point that the military-industrial complex is what we all should be concerned about. And he was a former general as a president. And it's one of those things where you look at it now, and even when you watch the news, they have former generals giving their commentary on what's happening in the world. And if you are someone who sells hammers, most of the problem is going to look like nails. And their answer is it's going to be prescribed around that direction of how do we use a hammer to solve that problem. Diplomacy becomes less of an importance because it's harder to make directly money from that type of diplomacy. And with so many of us, so bogged down with the everyday parts of life, even the thought of foreign policy, like even being able to connect these dots and saying, hey, should companies be able to profit from war? Why don't they contribute their resources to the war effort as a sign of patriotism? Why is the patriotism have to be the person who has to give of their lives? Just think about it. Someone goes over, risks their lives, and for the country, for the United States, and they come back and they have to go to a nonprofit, Wounded Soldiers or Wounded, one of these organizations, but yet they sacrificed their life for a government that now is asking them to get some assistance from a nonprofit. These are things that even when people say it's a military industrial complex, it may not be a military industrial complex because the soldiers are the most essential part of a industrial complex, and they're not benefiting really in any real way. They're actually taken advantage of. It's really more of a weapons industrial complex because those weapon systems are the ones that are profiting from all these activities. And at the point that, again, when we talk about who's sacrificing what patriotism, is very little patriotism when you're actually making money from wars. The motivation is not, the flag or liberty, or it's actually money. And if you look at some of these military platforms, these weapons platforms, not all of them are as good as they are professed to be. And the people who actually lose their lives are the soldiers. There's even some evidence that even back in World War II, with some of these airplanes that were designed, that many of the folks, died. More people would die during training than they died actually in combat because of some of the hazard engineering that was going on with getting these airplanes in production, as well as, even back in World War II in these wars, the people who won military contracts oftentimes had relationships with politicians that may not have required them to be vetted as they should, to make sure they're giving the government what they deserve as far as the end product. And of course, in the fog of war, it's oftentimes easier to blame, you can blame an enemy from outside than actually looking at the procurement process or looking at how these aircraft or these weapon systems, if they were properly developed. And these are things that you can see today, where literally you see, there was a report back in the day, the $1 Million Hammer, military, how they were, the government was being overcharged by so many of these weapon systems being sold. With the rising amount of money being budgeted to war, these are things that that are actually can happen. But if you challenge it, you can be called unpatriotic. So, looking at how we as a human family can stand up, there's definitely organizations out there that are doing these activities that can be very helpful. Code Pink is one organization that does a lot of organizing around the issue of anti-war and pursuing peace. A lot of times you don't want to say you're anti something, but war is probably something that you should be against. But really, we're people who are for peace, that see that war is a failure in human activity, not a success. And so, looking at ways to change that, and also the Black Alliance for Peace. That's another organization that does a lot of work in organizing around peace movements to make sure that our resources, our brothers and sisters, aren't being involved in any of these issues that, again, people are being killed and losing their life. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of profiteering going on that doesn't benefit the masses of the people, or even the people that are being told. So contextually, last March I was in Poland at the border of the Ukraine, helping students. I was in Warsaw, where the trains from Kiev were coming through with many of the Ukrainians fleeing the war. And as much as people talk about how proud and how fierce fighters, the people I saw were scared. They were just scared, like normal people would be scared if a large superpower was invading their country. And to make this an issue of about people being fearless and so strong, I think it's not fair to the folks who are literally dying in the thousands in these areas. And if by looking at some of the folks, if they were asked, would they rather have a war or would they rather have peace? I think most of those folks had already came up with their vacation plans already. They weren't looking for any type of war. And so I think as a human family, and again, these are always things that can be debated, we should be pursuing a position of diplomacy, sending more weapons from a country that's already in debt, that has really real issues domestically that have not. And this is not being somebody who's well, I think sometimes people, when they say that there are things domestically that need to be addressed, people start talking about the word isolationists and people who said don't worry about another part of the world. I think it's clear the world is interconnected. Well, with that being said, as always, definitely a pleasure to share with you. Definitely, I learned so much with your communications. Definitely, you want to reach out, info at iloveblackpeople.com. Share some of your comments there. Let us know, what you're interested in. We definitely use that to help us better understand what directions that we should go with the show. We definitely appreciate everyone's support. And as we always leave off, when we leave our show, I am because we are. And I definitely wouldn't be me without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And have a peaceful day with all the justice.
This is I Love Black People Radio on HUR Voices, Sirius XM Channel 141. I Love Black People is more than a radio show. I Love Black People is a call from our ancestors to protect us from racial profiling all across the world. Go to iloveblackpeople.com and become a member today. Membership empowers you to live fearlessly and protect Black people globally from racism and xenophobia. Join us today and become a member of our global network with an online global green book with Black-owned and Black-friendly businesses to protect you and your community. Membership is free, and with you, we will become 10 million strong worldwide. I am because we are. Special thanks to Aflac for supporting I Love Black People Radio.